12th of March 2004 was an unusual day in a small town in Fresno, California. Two women stood in the front yard of a house screaming for their children to be handed over to them. A huge man refused to give them the children. The screams cut the silence of the area like a knife. It was here that we would meet one of the most evil men in the world. This man believed that Jesus was a vampire, Marcus Wesson. Now let's back up a little bit and see how we got to 12th of March 2004. Marcus Wesson. Born in 1946, he was the eldest of 4 children. His father, Benjamin, was an abusive alcoholic who had never held a steady job. Wesson's father allegedly abused him and his siblings. He would hug and kiss them constantly when he was drinking. The children knew that the best way to avoid unwanted physical intimacy when their father, Benjamin, was drunk was to hide until he sobered up. One of Marcus Wesson's childhood friends even testified that Benjamin once offered to pay him $50 for oral sex. Wesson's father eventually decided to elope with a cousin with whom he had a homosexual relationship. This incestuous relationship may have led Wesson to believe that it was somehow normal to have sexual relations within one's own family. It is not known how much Wesson's mother, Carrie, knew about her husband's abuse of their children. The mother was not normal in the family either. She was a strict Seventh-day Adventist who made the family have daily Bible studies and whipped the children with an electric cord. Despite all this, as a child, Wesson was remembered by relatives as a kind and good boy. His favorite game was Preacher. There could be no other game in such a devoutly religious family. Wesson dropped out of high school at 17 and joined the army, becoming an ambulance driver. He was discharged in 1968 and immediately became involved with a married woman, Rosemary Maturina. Rosemary, who was almost a decade and a half his senior, already had several children. She soon had a son with Marcus Wesson, whom she named Adair. Although Wesson had a child, he showed little interest in him. Instead, he was much happier spending time with Rosemary's 8-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. Wesson's interest in Elizabeth soon became physical. He claimed that God had told him that Elizabeth was to be his wife. He held a formal marriage ceremony with the child in his home. He then took her out of school and began to train her personally. When Elizabeth was 12, he began to sexually abuse her. Elizabeth became pregnant with Wesson's child when she was 14, and they married as soon as she was of legal age. Wesson had 10 more children with Elizabeth by the time she was 26. Wesson did not stop raising his family. He would go on to marry and have children with his 3 nieces. He also had children with Ruby Ortiz, Rosa, and Sofina Solorio. These marriages were in addition to his marriages to 2 of his own daughters. How did he manage to have so many children? No matter how many children there were, no one realized it was wrong. Because Marcus Wesson brainwashed them all with religion. He told them the nonsense he believed in, and so the children did what he told them to do to stop it coming true. Marcus Wesson claimed that Jesus Christ was a vampire. He believed they were both connected to eternal life. He wrote in his homemade Bible that drinking blood is the key to immortality. To further support his mother's lifestyle, Wesson also bought a dozen antique coffins for the family. He claimed the coffins were used as beds for his children. Wesson was influenced by and felt a kinship with cult leader David Koresh. In 1993, during the siege of the Waco compound, Wesson watched the raid on television with his mouth agape. He told his family of children, "This man is just like me. He makes children for God," he said. Like Koresh, Wesson harbored a deep hatred for law enforcement. The head of the family, Marcus Wesson, was the father or grandfather of all 18 of his children. He had an incestuous relationship with his daughters Kiani and Sebrena and his nieces Rosa and Sofina Solorio and Ruby Ortiz. When Ruby Ortiz turned 13, Wesson told her she was old enough to marry him and that God wants a man to have more than one wife. He also told her that God's people were dying out and that she should protect God's children. He believed that having children was only for God. As a result, Ortiz and Wesson had a son, Aviv. The boys were very comfortable, but the girls were subjugated. Even their own brothers and cousins were kept away from them, lest they develop sexual feelings for other men. In addition to caring for their own children, child brides were responsible for cleaning and cooking. Wesson did not send any of his children or nieces and nephews to school. Instead, he homeschooled his children and spent hours in general education classes preaching his own bizarre beliefs. The children received very little education. Sometimes the older girls taught the younger children, and education seemed to consist of drawing and coloring. They didn't know anything else. They could not learn anything because they could not go to school. Marcus Wesson did not work while looking after so many children. He refused to work. Instead, he relied on welfare. According to Wesson, the head of the family should not work. The children often said they only had rice to eat and had to dig through rubbish bins for food. The children had no contact with the outside world. They lived in a hut, so no one noticed and reported the family to the government. Wesson's sons had a very different experience from his daughters, who claimed that their father had raised them as Seventh-day Adventists and was the best father anyone could have. This long-standing pattern was broken by Ruby and Sophina. They wanted to leave the Wesson clan. Marcus initially refused, but allowed them to leave on the condition that they leave behind their two sons, Jonathan and Aviv. When Ruby and Sophina went out into the outside world, they were just beginning to understand what Marcus Wesson had done. Once they did, they felt that what they had done was wrong, and they wanted their children back. And when they learned of Wesson's intention to move from Fresno to Washington, they were on their way. And so came that fateful day. On 12th of March 2004, Sophina and Ruby stood in the front yard of the Wesson home, screaming for their children back. Naturally, the neighbors who heard the voices immediately called the police. When the police arrived on the scene, they thought it was just a normal custody battle. The huge man inside was going to disrupt the ordinary in a way that would surprise everyone. The first thing the police wanted to do was talk to the man and try to persuade him. When they knocked on the door to talk to Wesson and tried to solve the problem, a huge man with grey hair down to his waist answered. Unlike the angry women outside, Wesson was calm and cooperative. He agreed to hand over the children, but first he wanted to say goodbye to them. He asked the officers to wait and went back inside, closing the door behind him. Shots were then fired from inside, one after the other. Interestingly, the police were reluctant to enter the house. After about an hour and a half, Wesson emerged from the front door. His clothes were covered with blood. Seeing him like this, the police rushed up to him and handcuffed him. Wesson did not resist. Other officers ran inside. The house was dark and silent. Several coffins were stacked against one wall. This made the officers uneasy, but did not stop them from moving forward. What the officers found in the back room was so horrifying that they would never forget what they saw. Inside was a pile of bloodied bodies, some of them children. Each had been shot in the eye. 9 people had died in that house. All 9 had been shot. Those 9 children were Wesson's children or grandchildren. When DNA tests were carried out to identify them, the real truth came out. At first, the authorities were unaware that this was the case. When the results came back, the true extent of Marcus Wesson's depravity was finally revealed. It turned out that they were all his own children and child brides. Wesson believed that he was Jesus and that if anyone tried to break up the family, they would all go to heaven. After Marcus Wesson's actions were exposed, the case began to build. The case was considered the worst mass murder in Fresno history. Before the trial began, Wesson was still fighting for control. He postponed his trial twice, saying he did not want a public defender and wanted to hire his own lawyers, David Mugridge and Gary Harvey. It was unclear whether Wesson could afford to pay for his own lawyers. The public defenders had to take over the case. On 3rd of March 2005, Wesson's trial finally began. Marcus Wesson was charged with 9 counts of first-degree murder and 14 counts of molestation and rape. As family members testified, many still loyal to him, the jury began to learn of the horrors Wesson had inflicted on his family. Wesson's defense was that he had not killed anyone, that Sabrina, his daughter and wife, had actually pulled the trigger, killing first the children and then himself. The evidence was inconclusive. There were no fingerprints on the gun, but there was DNA. His body was on top of the others, and the murder weapon was found underneath him. However, it is not known if he was lying where he fell or if it was planted there. Ruby and Sofina's testimony showed that Wesson had complete control over the family and ordered them to carry out this act if the police tried to intervene. Having Sabrina kill the children and then herself fit Wesson's model of having a woman do the hard work while he walked away. These arguments continued throughout the trial. Wesson was already guilty. He had to be punished for what he had done to the children over the years, but he also had to be convicted of murder. In the end, the jury didn't care who pulled the trigger. Marcus Wesson was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 102 years in prison for rape and molestation on 27 June 2005. He was sentenced to death for murdering his children and grandchildren. He was sent to San Quentin prison, the nation's largest death row. There, he would join notorious killers such as Rodney Alcala, Charles Ong, Richard Davis, and Scott Peterson. In March 2019, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed a reprieve on executions in the state, sparing Wesson's life. Although he avoided the death penalty, he will never be eligible for parole. Wesson called himself the Vampire King. This was because he believed that he was Jesus and that Jesus was a vampire. He believed that in another version of the Bible. Jesus drank blood to become immortal, so he should too. This explains the coffins found when the police entered the building and shows how delusional Wesson was. The boys broke their media silence in 2010 and spoke to reporters on ABC News. They have all tried to heal and move on with their lives as best they can. They are no longer in contact with Wesson. There were also people in the community who blamed Elizabeth because Wesson had started it all with her. But Elizabeth was very young when Wesson brainwashed her. She didn't know right from wrong at the time. Here was a pious and fascinating character, and he used her very well. Because these children had no contact with the outside world, they had to believe whatever Wesson said. That's why he was actually one of the biggest casualties in this path that started with Elizabeth. He had to look after the overlapping children at home without being able to experience his own childhood and youth. Marcus Wesson is still serving his sentence in San Quentin prison at the age of 77.